All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers.
Ooh, Outliers. That's a good one.
It is, and it's a book that really digs into the idea of success, but not in that kind of like cliche way, like just work hard and you'll make it.
Right, right. Like it's not all about just like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing.
Exactly. It's packed with all this research and real life examples.
I love how he uses stories to like illustrate these complex ideas.
Yeah, and we're going to be focusing on some of the more surprising things that contribute to success. Those like hidden advantages that we don't always think about.
The stuff that's like right under our noses, but we just never really noticed it.
Exactly. So to kick things off, Gladwell introduces this idea called the Matthew effect.
Oh yeah, the Matthew effect. I remember that.
And he uses this fascinating example from Canadian hockey.
Hockey. Okay, so I'm Canadian, so I got to hear this.
All right, well, get this. In Canadian hockey leagues, you see a really interesting pattern. A lot of the top players, the elite ones, they tend to be born in the first few months of the year.
Seriously, like January, February, March, those guys.
Yep, those guys. And it all comes down to the cutoff date for youth hockey leagues.
Which is January 1st.
Ah, so you've got kids in the same age group, but some are almost a full year older than others.
Exactly. And especially in those early years when you're like 8 or 9, that size and maturity difference can be a huge advantage on the ice.
Oh, totally. Like imagine you're a little kid playing against someone who's practically a teenager.
And that little advantage, it doesn't just disappear. It actually snowballs over time.
How so?
So the bigger kids, the more coordinated ones, they get more attention from coaches, more ice time, better training.
They're like the stars of their team. Everyone's like, oh, look at that kid.
Exactly. And by the time they reach their teens, that initial advantage that seems so small, it's become a massive gap in skill level.
Wow, so they're kind of set up for success from the beginning just because of when they were born.
And Gladwell calls this the Matthew effect based on that biblical verse. For unto everyone that hath shall be given.
So the more you have, the more you get, basically. Precisely. And this isn't just limited to hockey. Think about how this applies in other areas of life.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like in school, right?
Totally. Those kids who excel early on, they might get put in advanced classes, get more attention from teachers, and it just keeps building.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
That in the business world too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about entrepreneurs who get that early funding or those who have connections that open doors for them.
So it makes you wonder, are we really seeing natural talent, or is it just this accumulated advantage that starts from a young age?
It's a really interesting question, and it makes you rethink how we view talent and success.
Now, Gladwell doesn't stop there. He goes on to explore the role of practice and introduces this idea called the 10,000-hour rule.
I've heard of that one.
The basic idea is that to truly master any skill, whether it's playing an instrument, coding, writing, you need a massive amount of dedicated practice, like around 10,000 hours.
10,000 hours, that's a lot of time.
It is, and he uses the Beatles as a prime example.
The Beatles? Okay, yeah, they were amazing
Yeah.
music.
But their journey to becoming legends wasn't as simple as some might think.
Really? What do you mean?
Well, before Beatlemania, they spent a crazy amount of time performing in Hamburg, Germany.
Hamburg, like, wasn't that kind of a rough place back then?
Yeah, we're not talking fancy concert halls.
Yeah.
They were playing in these seedy clubs, long, grueling sets, 7 nights a week.
Wow, that sounds intense.
By the time they hit it big, they had already performed live over 1,200 times.
Seriously, 1,200 times. That's more than some bands do in their entire careers.
It's insane, and that constant performing that was their practice, it forced them to hone their skills, develop their sound.
So they had this crazy opportunity to just play and play and play.
They essentially had their own Hamburg, this like pressure cooker that forced them to become amazing.
It makes you wonder how many other talented musicians or artists or entrepreneurs are out there who just never get that kind of opportunity to really put in the time.
So when we talk about success, it's not just about talent or hard work. It's also about having access to the right opportunities at the right time.
The stars have to align in a way.
Now, Gladwell goes on to explore this idea of opportunity even further by looking at the story of Bill Gates.
Bill Gates, right? The Microsoft guy. I'm listening.
Everyone knows Bill Gates, but his path to success is more nuanced than you might think.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So back in the late 1960s, computers were these giant machines that took up entire rooms.
Yeah, I've seen the pictures. They were like these massive cabinets.
But Bill Gates, he was this math whiz, and he got a truly unique opportunity. His private school, Lakeside, they invested in a time-sharing computer terminal.
Hold on, time-sharing terminal? What's that?
It was basically a way to access a mainframe computer remotely.
And this was in the 60s.
Yeah, this was incredibly rare back then.
Yeah.
Most people didn't even have access to computers, let alone a direct connection to a mainframe.
So he was like one of the only kids in the world with this kind of access.
Exactly. And this early exposure, it ignited this chain reaction of opportunities for him.
Like what?
Well, he started testing software for a local company, which gave him even more programming time. He made connections with people in the industry.
So it wasn't just that he was brilliant, he was also in the right place at the right time.
Precisely. And Gladwell points out that Bill Joy, another tech innovator, had a similar experience with early access to computers.
It's like they were given this head start that most people could only dream of.
So it makes you wonder how much of what we consider success is really about being in the right place at the right time with the right resources.
It's a really good point. Like, how many talented individuals are out there who just never get that lucky break?
And Gladwell provides this fascinating example of this phenomenon in Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley, okay, the tech hub, what about it?
He noticed that a disproportionate number of successful software entrepreneurs were born in the mid-1950s.
The mid-50s, Is there a connection there?
Well, think about it. That specific time period coincides with the birth of the personal computer revolution.
Ah, so they were perfectly positioned to ride that wave of technological change.
Exactly. They were the right age at the right time to capitalize on this emerging industry.
It's like being born at the start of the gold rush. You're already ahead of the game.
So while individual effort definitely matters, you can't deny the impact of timing and demographic luck.
It's like some people are just dealt a better hand than others.
But then Gladwell throws a curveball. He introduces us to Christopher Langan, a man with an exceptionally high IQ.
Okay, high IQ, so he must be like super successful, right?
Well, that's where things get interesting.
I'm all ears.
Langan's IQ is estimated to be somewhere between 195 and 210.
Wow, that's like off the charts.
Yeah, you'd think with that level of intelligence, he'd be like a world-renowned scientist or something, right?
You would, but that's not exactly what happened.
Nope. Despite his incredible brain power, Langan actually struggled to achieve conventional success.
Seriously, how is that even possible?
He dropped out of college, ended up working blue-collar jobs.
That's wild. I mean, you'd think with an IQ that high, he could do pretty much anything he wanted.
It is a real head-scratcher, and to illustrate this point, Gladwell contrasts Langan with Robert Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer, the guy who led the Manhattan Project.
The one and only.
He was a brilliant physicist, obviously. But did he have like a super high IQ too?
Well, he was definitely brilliant, but his IQ wasn't nearly as high as Langan's.
So what was the difference if it wasn't just raw brain power? What allowed Oppenheimer to achieve so much?
Gladwell argues that Oppenheimer had something else, something he calls practical intelligence.
Okay, practical intelligence. I like the sound of that.
It's basically the ability to navigate complex situations, to get things done in the real world, to persuade and lead others.
So it's not just about being smart, it's about knowing how to apply that intelligence effectively.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting because Gladwell ties this concept of practical intelligence back to the work of sociologist Annette Lareau.
I'm familiar with her work. She studied different parenting styles, right?
That's right. She looked at how middle-class and working-class families raise their kids, and she found some pretty significant differences.
I remember she talked about concerted cultivation.
Exactly. That was her term for the middle-class approach, which is all about actively engaging kids in structured activities, encouraging them to reason and negotiate, and advocating for their needs.
And the working class approach was more about letting kids develop more independently.
Right. She called it natural growth. Less structured activities, more free time.
And she argued that these different parenting styles could have a big impact on how kids develop and interact with the world.
And potentially on their practical intelligence, too.
That makes sense. I mean, if you're constantly being encouraged to ask questions, to negotiate, to think for yourself.
You can be better equipped to handle those real-world challenges.
Totally. And Gladwell uses a really vivid example from Lareau's research to illustrate this point. She compared the experiences of two kids, Alex from a middle-class family and Katie from a working-class family.
And what did she find?
Well, when they had to interact with doctors or authority figures, Alex was much more assertive and confident, asking questions, challenging assumptions.
While Katie was more passive and deferential.
And Lareau argued that this wasn't because Katie was less intelligent. It was because of the way she had been raised to interact with authority.
To not question, to not make a fuss.
And you can see how that could play out in all sorts of situations. Job interviews, dealing with bureaucracy, even just navigating everyday life.
So if we circle back to Chris Langan and Robert Oppenheimer,
It makes you wonder if their different upbringings played a role in shaping their practical intelligence and their ultimate trajectories.
Oppenheimer came from a privileged background, probably experienced that concerted cultivation style of parenting,
He had the tools and the confidence to navigate those elite circles.
while Langan, who faced a lot of hardship and instability, might not have developed those same skills.
Like he had all this potential, but didn't have the know-how to make it work for him.
So it's not just about being smart, it's about having the right skills and the right mindset to actually make something of that intelligence.
It's a powerful reminder that success is shaped by so many factors beyond our control.
Okay, so we've talked about the Matthew effect, the 10,000-hour rule, the importance of opportunity, and now practical intelligence. But Gladwell doesn't stop there. He dives into another fascinating success story, that of Joe Flom.
Joe Flom, who's that?
He was this legendary corporate lawyer, the co-founder of Skadden Arps, one of the most powerful law firms in the world.
Powerful law firm. That sounds pretty successful.
He was, but what's interesting is how he got there. His story is kind of the opposite of that typical rags to riches narrative.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, Flom grew up during the Depression, the son of Jewish immigrants working in New York City's garment industry.
Not exactly the typical breeding ground for a high-powered lawyer.
Right. You wouldn't necessarily expect that background to lead to a career like his.
So how did he do it?
Gladwell breaks down Flom's success into 3 key lessons, and the first one is what he calls the advantage of being Jewish.
The advantage of being Jewish. Wait, I thought Jewish people faced a lot of discrimination back then.
They did, especially in the legal profession in the mid-20th century. Jewish lawyers were often excluded from those prestigious white shoe firms.
So they were shut out of the top tier.
Exactly. And because of that, they had to find other ways to make a living.
So what do they do?
They ended up specializing in areas that those big firms wouldn't touch, things like litigation and proxy fights, which are basically hostile corporate takeovers.
So they carved out a niche for themselves.
And it wasn't by choice, it was out of necessity.
They were like, well, if we can't join them, we'll beat them.
And here's where the story gets really interesting, because in the 1970s and 80s, there was this massive surge in corporate takeovers.
Ah, so suddenly those skills that nobody wanted became super valuable.
Exactly. Flom and his firm Skadden Arps, they had decades of experience in this area that was now in high demand.
They were like the only ones who knew how to play this new game.
Gladwell even tells the story about Flom's law school classmate Alexander Bickel, who was told point blank by a top firm that they wouldn't hire him because he was Jewish.
Wow, that's just blatant discrimination.
It was, but it also highlights how sometimes being excluded can actually open up unique and lucrative opportunities.
It's like they accidentally stumbled into the right place at the right time.
So lesson 1 is sometimes what seems like a disadvantage can actually become a huge advantage when the circumstances change.
It's like that saying, when one door closes, another one opens.
All right, lesson number 2 is about demographic luck.
Demographic luck. Okay, what's that all about?
Gladwell illustrates this using the example of Maurice and Mort Janklow, a father and son who were both lawyers.
Okay, father and son lawyers. Interesting.
Maurice, the father, he was born in an earlier generation, and he faced a lot of limitations. He struggled to make a decent living.
But his son Mort had it easier.
Much easier. He benefited from the economic boom and the expanded opportunities of his generation.
So even though they both had legal training, their success was vastly different just because of when they were born.
Exactly. It's a reminder that success isn't just about individual effort, it's also about the historical context you're born into.
You could be the most talented lawyer in the world, but if you're born at the wrong time, you might never get the chance to shine.
And Gladwell connects this back to Flom's generation. Born in the 1920s, they came of age during this unique period of economic expansion.
So they were in the right place at the right time.
And they had the skills and the drive to capitalize on those opportunities.
So it's like a combination of individual effort and being lucky enough to be born into the right circumstances.
But there's one more lesson Gladwell wants to explore, and this one takes us back to Flom's family background and the cultural legacy of New York City's garment industry.
The garment industry. Okay, I'm curious how that ties in.
He tells the story of Louis and Regina Bourgonicht, Jewish immigrants, who arrived in New York in the late 19th century.
New York City back then, that was like the melting pot of America.
It was, and the Bourgonichts, they had this one crucial skill. They were dressmakers.
Dressmakers, okay, so they knew how to sew.
And at that time, the garment industry in New York was booming.
So they had a skill that was in high demand.
They were able to build a successful business even though they barely spoke English and had very little money.
It's like they landed on their feet.
But it wasn't just luck. The garment industry was incredibly demanding. It required long hours, resourcefulness, a relentless work ethic.
So they had to hustle.
And Flom, growing up in a garment-making family, he was immersed in that environment from a young age.
It's like he absorbed that work ethic by osmosis.
Gladwell argues that Flom's upbringing instilled in him those values of hard work, practicality, and a drive to constantly be learning and adapting.
And those values became his greatest assets in the legal world.
It wasn't just about being a brilliant lawyer, it was about having the right mindset.
The grit, the resilience.
Exactly, and that allowed him to thrive in a field that was constantly changing.
So it's like those early experiences, even if they seem unrelated to your eventual career, they can shape you in profound ways.
And Gladwell introduces this concept of meaningful work. He argues that the Borgenics' enthusiasm for their jobs, even though they were incredibly demanding, stemmed from a sense of ownership and purpose.
They were building something, creating something.
They were in control of their own destiny.
And that gave their work meaning beyond just a paycheck.
So we see this thread running through all these success stories. Bill Gates, with his passion for programming the Beatles, putting in their 10,000 hours, the Borgenics finding fulfillment in the garment industry.
It's like that passion that's what fuels their success.
But now Gladwell takes us in a completely different direction. He starts talking about cultural legacies and how they can impact communication even in life or death situations.
Cultural legacies. Okay, this should be good.
He dives into this concept of a culture of honor, which is often found in hurting communities or regions where reputation and respect are everything.
So like those old Western movies where cowboys duel over the slightest insult?
Exactly. In these cultures, even small insults can trigger really strong reactions.
It's like their honor is on the line.
And Gladwell draws this fascinating connection between this culture of honor and the world of aviation, specifically communication breakdowns in the cockpit.
The cockpit, wait, how does that connect?
Well, he uses the case of Korean Air, which experienced a series of crashes in the 80s and 90s.
Korean Air crashes, what happened?
Investigations revealed that communication problems in the cockpit were a contributing factor to many of these accidents.
So the pilots weren't communicating effectively.
And that led to some tragic mistakes.
Okay, but why weren't they communicating? Was it a language barrier or something?
Gladwell brings in the work of Geert Hofstede, who studied cultural dimensions.
Cultural dimensions.
One dimension he identified is called power distance, which basically measures how much a society accepts and expects hierarchy and deference to authority.
Power distance, so like how comfortable people are with questioning their superiors.
Exactly, and Korea has a very hierarchical culture.
So there's a high power distance.
And Gladwell suggests that this cultural background might have made it difficult for co-pilots to speak up and challenge their captains.
Even when they saw potential problems.
They might have been hesitant to question authority, even in situations where lives were at stake.
That's terrifying to think about.
It is, and to illustrate this point, Gladwell analyzes cockpit transcripts from some of these crashes.
So we can see how these communication breakdowns actually played out.
In one crash, the Korean Air 801 crash in Guam, both the first officer and the flight engineer, they hinted at concerns about the weather, but they never directly challenged the captain's decision to land.
They were too afraid to speak up.
And that deference to authority, it might have contributed to the disaster.
It's like those cultural patterns. They're so deeply ingrained that we might not even be aware of how they're influencing our behavior.
And that can have serious consequences, especially in high-stakes situations.
It makes you wonder what other subtle cultural influences are at play in our own lives.
Okay, so we've gone from hockey to the Beatles to Bill Gates to corporate law to plane crashes, and now Gladwell takes us to the rice paddies of East Asia.
Rice paddies. Wait, what?
I know it's a bit of a jump, but he's exploring the connection between agricultural practices and mathematical ability.
Agricultural practices and math.
Oh.
Okay. I'm officially intrigued. So we were talking about rice paddies and math. How does that even work?
Yeah, it's a weird connection, right? But Gladwell argues that the way rice farming works in East Asia, it's actually shaped those cultures to value things like hard work and thinking long term and being really persistent.
Okay, I can see how those things are important for success in general, but math specifically.
Well, rice cultivation is way more complicated than you might think. It's not just planting and harvesting.
Really?
Oh yeah, you have to meticulously plan everything, pay attention to every little detail, understand ratios and spatial relationships.
Huh, like what kind of stuff?
Think about it. They have to level the fields, perfectly manage the water levels, precisely calculate spacing and fertilizer amounts.
Wow, I never realized rice farming was so intricate.
It's like a giant math problem in real life.
And Gladwell suggests that all those demands, they've kind of translated into better math skills for people from those cultures.
Yeah, he points out that East Asian students consistently do better in math than Western students, especially with things like fractions and complex problem solving.
Which are the areas where you really need to, like, stick with it and not give up.
Exactly. It's like that mental discipline from rice farming, it somehow carries over to other areas.
Fascinating how these seemingly unrelated things can connect.
And Gladwell contrasts this with Western agriculture, which is way more reliant on machines.
Oh, yeah. We use tractors and combines and stuff.
So it's less about that constant, intensive labor.
Maybe that's why there's a difference in how we approach work and learning.
Like maybe the type of work we do, even from a young age, it shapes our brains in a way.
Makes you think.
And then he brings up this summer vacation problem in the U.S.
Summer vacation problem was that?
He argues that those long breaks from school, they can actually hinder learning, especially for kids who don't have a lot of opportunities during the summer.
So they lose some of what they learned during the school year.
It's like taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back.
So maintaining that momentum is key.
And this leads us to the last case study. Gladwell talks about the KPP schools.
KPP schools, those are those charter schools, right?
Yep, they're in low-income areas, and they're known for being really academically rigorous.
Like they have high expectations for the students.
And they've had amazing success in raising math scores.
So what's their secret?
Well, they have longer school days, school on Saturdays, shorter summer breaks.
Wow, that's intense.
It is, but Gladwell says they're basically mirroring that continuous effort you see in rice farming cultures.
They're trying to create that same culture of hard work and high expectations.
Like if you work hard, you can achieve anything.
And it seems to be working out there. Their students are outperforming their peers and going to college at much higher rates.
Gladwell tells the story about Marita, a 12-year-old Kia PP student. She wakes up before 6 every day, goes to school on Saturdays, does homework until late at night.
That's a lot of dedication.
She's making a bargain. She says she's willing to put in the effort, and KPP is giving her the tools to succeed.
It's inspiring, but also kind of makes you wonder if that level of intensity is sustainable for everyone.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, pushing kids to excel is important, but you don't want them to burn out either.
It's about finding that balance, right?
This deep dive has really made me rethink how we view success.
Me too. It's not just about individual talent or hard work. It's way more complicated than that.
It's about opportunity, cultural legacies, practical intelligence, meaningful work.
All those hidden advantages that we don't always recognize.
So as we wrap up, here's a thought for you to consider.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about your own journey. How has your background shaped your values and your work ethic? What opportunities have you had? How have you made the most of them?
And most importantly, what does meaningful work look like for you? How can you find that passion that will really drive you to achieve amazing things?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of success. We hope it's given you some new insights and some things to think about.
And who knows, maybe you'll uncover some of your own hidden advantages along the way.
Thanks for listening.